Hello and welcome to WIF's Laptop Cinema Club. I am beyond thrilled to bring you a discussion today with Traci Curry, co-director and co-producer of the riveting and harrowing Showtime documentary, Attica. The film explores the events 51 years ago at the Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York during the bloodiest prison uprising in American history. On September 9th, 1971, incarcerated men, predominantly Black and brown, seized control of the brutal institution to demand better food, access to hygiene products, religious freedom, opportunities for schooling, and most importantly, an immediate cessation to the cruel and inhumane treatment they suffered from the all-white guards and administration. These men held the prison for almost 5 days, but in the end, the overwhelming forces of white power enacted a brutal reprisal that left scores of people dead, including the very hostages that the powers that be were claiming to save. This film deftly weaves the stories of the men at the center of the tragedy, the prisoners, with those of the men working as mediators, observers, and advocates. It is filled with the type of archival footage that demands we stare at the horrors done in our name, even as we desperately want to look away. Attica is an unflinching record of an evil and a wrong, and it behooves all of us to witness it. Traci, I am so excited to have you here joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Ebony.
So I want to start with you and your personal connection to the issues raised in Attica. How much did you know about the Attica uprising before you started working on the project?
Well, to be entirely honest with you, I didn't know very much about it. I'd worked with Stanley on a couple of previous projects. And as we were wrapping one up, he kind of approached me and was like, well, what do you think about Attica? And honestly, I didn't think about Attica. I sort of had a vague understanding that there had been some disturbance at a prison in upstate New York. I knew the scene from Dog Day Afternoon that is iconic, where Attica gets shouted by Al Pacino's character. I knew the mention in the Nas song, If I Rule the World, opening every cell in Attica. So I understood that there was something about that word in this moment, in this place, that had this resonance in the culture, but I didn't know much more about it beyond that.
So once you started working on the project and started having these conversations with your co-director, Stanley Nelson, what were the kind of, immediate goals for the film? How did you talk through how you wanted to shape it?
Yeah, we had a lot of those conversations early on, because I always say that this could really very easily have been a multi-part series, but we had the time that we had. And so we thought a lot about what is the best, strongest, truest story that we can tell in the time that we had. And ultimately, we realized that it's telling the story of the 5 days of the rebellion. But certainly there is a part of this story that includes the lead up to what happened, not only at Attica, but at other prisons in New York where there had been uprisings the previous year. There's a connection there. And then obviously all of the legal part of what happened following the 13th. But once we sort of understood that the story that we were telling was about the rebellion, the reasons why it happened, and ultimately that horrible response that the state had on the 13th, we then kind of understood, thanks to the help of some of our great advisors on the film, Heather Thompson, who wrote Blood in the Water, and Judy Clark, that this story in some ways is kind of like that parable of the blind men of the elephant, that depending on where people were situated around it and what parts of it they touched and their positions of power within this story, your experience is going to be slightly different. And so what we really wanted to do was tell a 360-degree story that included all of those perspectives and all of those voices. Obviously, central to that was the prisoners, because this happened because this was something that they made happen. But it touched so many different people. And I think when you're telling a story like this, that's really about a system, all of the people that are in it are caught up in that system. And so we really wanted to kind of get at that. So that is, of course, the former prisoners, the Attica brothers, that is also the families of the hostages, because we really wanted to make clear that before Attica was known as it is now, as this prison where this infamous incident happened, Attica was a place, it was a community. There were families that lived there, as you see in the film, who not only relied upon the prison as sort of the source of their ability to make a living. It was really the economic driver of this town, but there was actually a lot of pride excuse me, culturally around being known as sort of a prison family. And that's the way that these communities really identified. So that was important to us, as was obviously the media, which is a huge part of this story, and then the observers as well. So our initial approach, we understood we wanted to tell the story of that 5 days, and then we wanted to tell it from all of these perspectives and kind of layers of shifting power and influence that that kind of were in play during that time.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to the 360 view that you offer, because the film really expertly and authentically incorporates the perspectives, the lived history of not just the prisoners, but as you say, the family members of the hostages, acknowledging their pain, their fears, while not denying that perhaps their perspective on the story is not the full story, and that there are other perspectives that are just as legitimate. But I want to start first by talking about the perspectives of the prisoners themselves. So that's the centerpiece of the film, right? This firsthand testimony of the prisoners who were there during the uprising 50 years ago. And it is really so remarkable to think about, to hear the stories from these men, these elderly men, and watch them remember and watch the ways that they have, worked through and perhaps healed from, or perhaps haven't healed from what has happened to them. What was the outreach like initially to the people that you included in the film? And did you have any difficulties persuading them to sit down with you?
Yeah, so starting out, obviously this is something that happened 50 years ago. So I wasn't even sure how many people would still be around, let alone people who are around and willing and able to talk about it, and able to talk about it in a way that has that clarity of recollection. So one of the things that we were greatly helped by was in the year 2000, when the prisoners finally got their settlement, as you see sort of during the credits of the film. The judge who oversaw the allocation of the settlement funds, his name's Michael Teleska. He was a judge, I believe, in the Western District of New York. He took this extraordinary step of allowing every single survivor who was a prisoner on the 13th to either come into his courtroom or call into his courtroom and take as much time as they wanted to tell their story of what happened to them on the 13th. And so because it happened in federal court, there's a transcript of this. And so I was greatly helped by that document, and it's several hundred pages of long. I read all of it. And obviously that was 20 years ago, but I kind of was able to get a sense from that document of who might still be around, who seemed to have a story to tell, where people were located. And my background is in journalism. And so from there, it was just sort of doing the work of finding those folks, reaching out to them, getting on the phone, and having those, initial awkward conversations that you might not be surprised to know that many people, having a stranger call them on the phone and ask if they could please share in great detail the experience of the defining trauma of their lives, is not something that everybody is jumping to do, right? So there were certainly people who preferred not to. There were certainly people who were not too pleased that I was bringing it up. There were also people that tried to talk about it. And I know there's one guy that literally broke out in tears on the phone in the middle of my speaking with him. It was just like, I just can't do it. So there was certainly some of that. But fortunately for us and for the film, there were enough people who were still around and who were really gracious enough and willing enough to go back there and recall it for us. And so that's sort of the process that I used to locate the prisoners. So let's talk about, the materials that you use to present this narrative and to, bolster an audience's understanding of what happened. And I'm thinking specifically about, the archival footage. You mentioned, the transcripts that you used, but in terms of like the archival footage, how did you work with, your archival producer, your consultants, et cetera, to find what you needed and then select and winnow down what would ultimately end up on screen? Well, I have to give all credit to our fabulous archival producer, Rosemary Rotundi, who is one of the nicest people you'll ever meet, but also kind of like a pit bull when it comes to tracking down archival footage. She is pleasantly persistent. So we understood going into it that obviously the media went in and recorded this, and that the local news affiliates that are attached to the national networks had at some point had this footage. And so that bucket, which is the stuff that you see in DR, the reporters outside of the prison, that really was a matter of just kind of going again and again and again to these networks and asking them, do you have any more? What else do you have? What else do you have? Asking anybody that we thought might have some of that footage, Stuart Dan and John Johnson, who were reporters that were there. We spoke with them about their archives and what do they have, and it really was just kind of digging and digging and digging to get that material. And then ultimately Stanley was able to work with the networks to get the original film, which is why it looks so great in the final version of the film. So that's what that bucket was. Then there is the material that you see in black and white. It's kind of the grainy footage looking down into the yard, the footage that you see of the helicopters and the shootings. That was all recorded by the New York State Police, who went in there with the camera. Obviously did not really think that they were indicting themselves in anything, because they wouldn't have recorded what happened. I think they thought that they were, going to be collecting evidence that would be used against the prisoners ultimately. And all of that is still held by the New York State Archives. And so we were able to get that footage from them. And then you have all of that harrowing footage and photographic images from the 13th during the retaking and after the retaking. And all of those images were evidence. So as you see in the credits, there were decades of lawsuits. And so there was a team of lawyers that was led by, excuse me, a woman named Elizabeth Fink. And they pretty much worked pro bono for 2-3 decades on this case. But over the course of that, they collected all of these images that the investigative branch of the New York State Police took when they went to the yard. Again, obviously not thinking they were indicting themselves in anything. And we were able to access Liz's archive that contained all of that evidence and all of those images. And so that's where that came from.
I mean, filmically, what you and Stanley have put together is stunning. It is compelling viewing. It's also incredibly difficult viewing. And I'm thinking, in particular about the ways that you present some things in black and white, and then there's a shift to color, once we see the aftermath of the retaking of the prison, which immediately reduces the distance, that a viewer has from the horrors that were perpetrated that day. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of filmic techniques that you use throughout the film to guide the viewer, not to manipulate the viewer, but to sort of, do some of the work of the storytelling?
Yeah, I think particularly for the telling of the retaking, it was important for us to bring the audience down there into the yard. Mm-hmm. So when you hear, excuse me, when you hear someone say, I looked down and there was blood in the water and I saw someone's dentures, to see that blood, the red blood puts you right there where the prisoners were. And so what was really, I don't want to say nice because it wasn't nice, but I think was really powerful for us to find those moments where the footage was in conversation with what people were saying in the interviews. And in some ways, I mean, the way that the men described what happened was compelling enough on its own. But I think the footage just worked so beautifully in that moment to kind of evoke the emotion and what they were witnessing as it was happening. And so there were moments like that where the footage just kind of really supported the story and added an extra layer of depth to the story. There were also moments and we had hundreds of hours of footage, and we all, Stanley, me, our co-producer, Sushana Dubray, Rosemary, the archival producer, the editors, we watched it all over and over and combed through it with a fine-tooth comb. But what happens when you do that is you find little moments, again, that are in conversation with what people are saying. So when you hear the prisoner say, we did not believe the commissioner when he was coming into the yard negotiating with us, because we had a television and we saw him on television saying something different outside. And so we did not trust him. we come through the footage and aha, there's that moment where Russell Oswald is talking to a member of the press and he's saying they're asking for the world, they want everything, they want everything. Which of course they were not asking for the world, they were asking for a very specific list of 30 demands. But that existed in the footage. And so it's just, as a filmmaker, it's always so serendipitous and lovely when you have those moments where you can put people in conversation with the footage. And that's, I think, where that real magic comes together, where you have this collection of elements that kind of, this alchemy where that all comes together and really starts to become a film.
How do you, as a filmmaker, reconcile, or perhaps reconcile is the wrong word, how do you navigate the tremendous psychic cost to you as the documentarian when you're viewing, as you say, hundreds of hours of footage, when you're watching, this horrible footage, when you're looking at terrible archival photos, when you're listening to these men relate these incredible, painful events, how do you protect yourself? How do you keep working? This is something that, perhaps many emerging, aspiring documentarians don't think about sufficiently, but when you're dealing with this kind of issue, this kind of project, the cost is so heavy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There's this saying that what you work on works on you. And in my life and in my work, I have found that to be very true. But a couple things about that. One, I cannot separate the making of this film from the time in which it was made, right? So I was like here in my living room, as we all were in our little pandemic boxes at that time in 2020, early 2020, making this film. So in some ways, sitting with the trauma of Attica insulated me a bit from the trauma that was happening out in the world. So I don't know, had we been doing it in a normal time, how I would have sat with that. But I don't know, it's kind of a weird thing to say, but being able to kind of focus on that and the horror of that made it a lot easier for me to deal with the horror of everything that was going on. And the other thing I'll say is that it is a difficult film to watch. And at the screenings, one of the things that we hear from audiences and from people afterwards is that it stayed with them, that they couldn't sleep, that they were disturbed. And I feel like that is as it should be when you are watching a film that ultimately is about the American state massacring 39 of its own citizens. I think if what we are asking of the people in the film, not only the prisoners, but every single person that was touched by this. I mean, even the observers say that they still live with the guilt that they could have done more, which of course there wasn't anything more they could do. But I think if what we are asking as filmmakers is for these people to go back and relive this trauma that they saw for themselves, and so they can never get rid of those images. I think if what the audience is asking of these people is to relive it for the sake of being educated and enlightened about what happened, the very least that we can do is sort of take on some of that to ourselves and sit with it. And in some ways, I almost feel like as filmmakers and as the audience is part of the cost of admission. If you're going to sit with this story and learn the story from these people who lived it, that part of it is what you should take some of that onto yourself, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the larger context in this moment is that you're working on the film in the early part of 2020, then, May and June 2020 see the death of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and, the uprisings across this country. And then, as we progress further, the conversation about, what's called critical race theory, but is radically misunderstood, is deployed as, rhetorical boogeyman by forces on the far right. Can you talk a little bit about the urgency of, a film like this, and maybe even reactions to the film from people who are perhaps not sympathetic to your
Yeah.
aim? It was interesting to see, family members of the hostages, of the guards, both now and in the footage, viewing the oppressive forces of, the state as heroes in that moment, while other perspectives are like, these are villains, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, like the disconnect and like
Yeah.
the vitality and the urgency of this project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the making of this film is very much in conversation with the times. I mean, I quite literally, where I live happens to be on a route where a lot of protests in Brooklyn pass down my street. And so I literally was inside working on this film while a protest was happening right under my window. I watched a group of police descend upon a protester, not knowing what was going to happen in that moment. And I think what it did for me was really crystallize what this film is really about, which is about this righteous and just challenge to the abuses of state of power and the lengths to which the state will go in order to reassert its power and dominance. And I think that we can never forget that. And I think we saw that at Attica, and we saw that not only in what happened to George Floyd in response to the protest as well. And there was also the pandemic, right? Which when it first broke out, people in prisons were essentially left to get sick and die, as were, by the way, the people that worked in the prisons with those people. And so all of that was just very much right there and crystallized for me what the story was about. And yeah, that continues to be the case as we now see stories like this as a matter of policy being erased. It'd be illegal to teach something like this. And I think if we are serious about the work of trying to create a country that lives up to its supposed ideals, as Dr. King said, what they said on the paper, all of these notions of freedom and justice and liberty, then we have to be very clear-eyed first about the way in which this state, the American state, has denied those things to people in the past. And so it really has made this film feel so much more urgent and so much more necessary, and has made me so much more grateful that it has gotten this platform with the nomination that it has. I think as far as people's feelings that may be in discord with the film, I don't want to speak for anyone. I'll say that I have been asked a few times why there are none of the hostages or the guards were in the film. And as I said earlier, our intention was to tell a 360-degree story. So I certainly reached out to and was in contact with several of those people. We had plans to film them. They had agreed to be in the film. And shortly before we were filming, they all kind of, as a group, changed their mind and decided to not be in the film. I will not speak for them and their reasons about it. But I do know that, there are certainly people that do have the perspective that the state troopers were heroes, that they were going in to take this prison back from these violent criminals who were threatening, in some cases, their loved ones. I mean, there were people that actually went in during the retaking who had relatives that worked inside the prison and were hostages. And so, that is a point of view that they had. I think perhaps some of that hesitance was a feeling that there's been a very vocal and visible criticism about law enforcement. And, maybe that sort of informed their feelings that they don't want to be in this kind of a public platform identifying as law enforcement. I don't know. I wouldn't want to speak for them, but we certainly did make the effort to get those folks into the film for sure.
Let's talk about the system. Because one of the really compelling realizations of the film, especially for viewers who, may not be aware of the exploitative nature of what's, called criminal justice in this country, is the way that an entire economy, the lifeblood of Attica, is dependent upon the policing, the suppression, and, oppression of these Black and brown men. That in fact, it is necessary for this prison to exist, for the town to operate, for these people to live. Can you talk about the ways that you explored that in the film?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that literally continues to be the case today. There was an article, I think, within the last month in the New York Times about a town, I believe in California, where the prison is closing. And so the whole town is falling apart because that is their entire economy. And I think in many ways, the system, the way it actually works is really invisible to us by design, right? Like Attica was a prison where most of the people that were in the prison came from cities. They came from Buffalo, they came from New York City, they came from Rochester, but the prison is in this remote Attica's not even a city, it's a village. It's in this remote place behind these 30-foot high walls. That's by design, so that we cannot see what actually happens behind these walls, the violence. And I'm not just talking about prisoner violence against guards, I'm talking about guard violence against prisoners. It was one of the things that was in the demands of the men at Attica. They wanted prosecution for guards who harmed prisoners, which, by the way, did not happen for the first time at Attica until 2014. There was a guard, there were 3 guards, I believe, that beat a man nearly to death who was a prisoner, and 1 or more of them were prosecuted. And actually, since that, there are cameras. So there's thousands of cameras that have been installed inside Attica since that happened. But that was in 2014. This is 40 something years after these men were trying to bring attention to this and let the world know that this is what was happening. And so I don't think that we have a real, we did not then. And I think the men at Attica brought some visibility to it, but we still don't really have a clear understanding of like what that ecosystem is and what the system is. I think, I was thinking about it recently and I realized that for most folks, their understanding of what prison is, what it looks like, what that experience is, comes from fictional portrayals of prison. I mean, I think you could ask most people and they could say, oh, prison looks like this. These are the people that go there. This is the way it works. But when you ask them how they know that, it comes from movies and television. So we really don't understand. Like, we don't understand, for instance, that there is an industry that makes money off of the phone calls that prisoners make, the voicemails that they leave. If you want to send an email, that costs money. There are companies that profit off of this, but I don't think that we really have an understanding of any of those things. And so, I really hope that, if anything, the film is an invitation to curiosity for people. I mean, I think the issues that it deals with are so intractable that it doesn't necessarily offer any clear answers, but I do hope it's an invitation for people to ask questions about the system that we're kind of allowing in our name today.
So you and your co-director make a deliberate choice not to reveal the crimes for which these former prisoners were incarcerated. Can you talk a little bit about that choice?
Yeah, I think in some ways the ask that we are making of the audience is a tough one, right? Because this is not a story about wrongfully incarcerated people, right? This is a story about people who did crimes and went to prison. And the ask is a both and situation, to both recognize that that is true, but also recognize that these people do not cease to be human beings the moment that they cross the door into the prison. And should we not expect our government and our state to have a higher standard than the one that they're holding these people to? In other words, if what we're saying is that the system works when there is a crime and there's punishment and then there's balance, what do we think about our state that says, no, actually, when you get punished, you will get punished again and again and again. You will be deprived of your humanity. You will be deprived of your rights. You will come out of the actual physical prison, but still continue to not be able to be a full citizen in this country, not be able to vote, have your housing, all of these things, your ability to get a job denied to you. So I think it is complicated, but I think that what the film asks us is to do both things at the same time, and recognize that it is a violence that the state does to people when it dehumanizes folks. The population today, which is 2 million, the largest in the world here in the United States, 22% of the prison population in the world here in the United States. It is a violence that the state does to people when they are allowed to be dehumanized by the government in this way. So I think it is a challenge to people to think in a way that is a little more complicated than I think that we are accustomed to thinking, but I think is necessary, again, if we're to be clear-eyed about the injustices and the violence that the state does to people through this system.
So now that the film is complete, it's out there, as you look back and reflect on the work, this towering work that you were part of, can you share perhaps one story or one moment that has really stuck with you, that continues to, kind of work its way through your system, that will never leave you?
Wow. I wouldn't say that it is one moment, but probably the impression that was left on me by the collective moments, right? So I don't know what I was expecting in terms of people's emotion about this 50 years later. But to a person, prisoner, family member, media, National Guardsman, observer, this trauma is still so present for all of these people. And I don't think that there was a single interview that I did where if someone did not break down crying, an explosion of rage happened, the injustice of it all. And I think that really is what will stay with me the most, is the harm that has been done to these people, and the injustice and the callousness of the state. I think that because so much of the work in speaking with people before we sat down with them on camera and then being on camera doing the interviews was really holding space for people's trauma and people's pain. And I think that is the thing that probably will stay with me the most, is that, you know, for so many of these folks, every year for the last 50 years between September 9th and September 13th is deeply triggering and troubling and re-traumatizing for them. And I think just sitting with all of these people in that is the thing that will stick to me. There's this line in a book that was written by Malcolm Bell, who was the prosecutor who attempted, but was not allowed to prosecute the police for the crimes, for the law enforcement for the crimes that happened. And he writes, Attica has a way of staying with people. And I have found that to be true, not only for everybody who was there, whose lives were touched by it, but for myself, for Stanley, for all of us who worked to tell this story.
Traci, thank you so much for being with us. This has been a phenomenal conversation about an absolutely phenomenal movie. You're an amazing filmmaker. We can't wait to see what you work on next. Attica is available now for streaming for free on YouTube and Amazon. It is an absolutely vital film to watch. I encourage you, if I could order you to watch it, I would. But I think, you know, it is a part of our history that we must reckon with. So thank you again so much for being with us, Traci. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation.